I first just want to start off by thanking all of you for coming. I'm really excited to see so many people here. I also just like to thank my dad for coming from Wisconsin. I really appreciate it that you made it out here. And so as Marcelo mentioned, I'm going to be talking about my thesis, which is called What Can Massachusetts Teach Washington, D.C.? Explaining Variation in Student Achievement Across the United States of America. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the state of American education today. Every 2 years, the Department of Education administers the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a standardized exam for 4th graders, 8th graders, and 12th graders, given to a random sample of students across the country in all 50 states, Washington, D.C., and the Department of Defense schools. So let's take a look a little bit at the 2013 8th grade mathematics results. Nationally, only 26% of students scored at the proficient level. In the highest performing state in the nation, Massachusetts, 54% of students were proficient or advanced. Students performed worst in Washington, D.C., where only 19% of students scored at the proficient or advanced level. And so there's these huge variations between high-performing states like Massachusetts or Minnesota and New Jersey, and other places that perform really, really badly like Mississippi or Alabama or D.C. And the point of my thesis was to really try to get at what explains these differences. What makes one state really, really high-performing and another state really low-performing? So basically, this leads me to my research motivations. First, there's been a lot of studies done in education examining individual variables and their effect on student achievement. So researchers have looked at anything from the effect of race on student achievement, the effect of charter schools on student achievement, and basically what I did in my literature review in my thesis was to group these myriad of variables into 5 big categories. First, student and family background. Second, schools and teachers. Third, finance. Fourth, government policy variables. And fifth, unions. What's particularly interesting to me about the literature is that there actually has been no comprehensive study that's examined all of these variables together at once and tried to get at kind of what the effects are relative to one another. So today, I'm going to walk you through a little bit of background on this literature and the variables and their effects. Then I'm going to talk about the cross-sectional model that I developed for the 2011 8th grade scores. Then I'll talk a little bit about the panel data model I developed for the 2003 through 2013 NAEP scores. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about the main takeaways, and I'll offer 2 policy recommendations. So first, background. For the first category of student and family background, in 1966, James Coleman released a landmark 700-page study that for the first time demonstrated rather conclusively that student background mattered far more than any other variable in student achievement. Other scholars have then followed up this research by looking at specific student background variables like socioeconomic status, family income, race, parental education. The second category of school and teacher factors has looked at things like the debate over class size, where there's one group of researchers who suggest that class size does matter for education achievement and encourage lower class sizes, and then another group of researchers that suggest, well, class size, especially relative to other school factors, perhaps isn't really all that important. And so ultimately, the people who say that class size probably isn't all that important focus on teacher quality, although it's really hard to say what we mean by teacher quality because of the ways that teacher quality might be measured. And then finally, we could also look at the type of schools within this broad category. So charter schools, private schools, and traditional public schools all make up kind of this idea of the type of school that you go to might matter for student achievement. Next, we can think about finance factors. This has to do with things like per pupil expenditures or average salaries. My thesis advisor actually wrote that there is no strong systematic relationship between school expenditures and school performance. And this has been a common refrain that in a lot of studies that have come out on finance variables and their effect on student achievement. So it seems that how much money is spent on education doesn't actually really matter, although a little caveat, there are a few studies that dispute this finding. Ultimately, though, it seems that the way schools spend money is far more important than how much money is spent. Next, we can look at the government and policy factors. And I realize that a lot of the variables that I've discussed can go under this category, as state governments are largely the ones that shape education policy in this country. But I'm going to focus actually on the standards movement that's developed since the 1990s. And so the standards movement encapsulates things like No Child Left Behind, more recently the Common Core State Standards, which is a new national set of standards for students across the country. And there's, again, some mixed results in the literature on this, especially because standards are often most measured by standardized exams to see if students are learning what we expect them to be learning. So the mixed conclusions, there's some studies that say stronger standards leads to higher student achievement, and then other studies that focus on the standardized exams themselves, suggesting that perhaps they hamper student achievement. Finally, we can talk about my most favorite thing is unions. And there's huge disagreement in the research on the effect of teachers' unions. One very clear group of people who think that unions matter quite a bit for student achievement and positively influence it, and another group of people who think that, well, unions actually kind of have a negative impact on student achievement. So despite these kind of huge disagreements, there's some general consensus that's developed that unions harm the highest achieving and lowest achieving students and actually maybe help the middle ground students. And the theory behind this is that the highest and lowest achieving students need the most adaptable and flexible school type models to meet their special needs, and unions aren't very good at that kind of adaptability. Whereas the middle ground students need a more stable and consistent educational experience, and unions are more or less good at providing that. Nevertheless, there's significantly limited research in this data, and so scholars today are focusing more and more on the effect of unions. Next, I'm going to talk about the cross-sectional model, and for the cross-sectional model, I focused on 2011 8th grade mathematics NAEP scores. So what I basically did, this is going to be a very broad overview, there's lots of specifics in the actual thesis, is I took all of the variables for the 5 categories that I've just talked about and regressed them onto the mathematics NAEP scores. And so the purpose with this was to identify the model with the most explanatory power, because I was really trying to get at the variation in the student scores. And so ultimately then I focused on the significant variables within the models that I developed, and also then thinking about the variation that was explained in the NAEP scores. So here's a list of the variables that I included in both actually the panel data and the cross-sectional analyses. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'm actually just going to focus on 3 variables. National school lunch eligibility, which is a proxy for poverty rates, student-teacher ratios, and then for the cross-sectional analysis, I'll talk about the instructional per pupil expenditure, and for the panel data, I'll talk about the average salary variable, so these finance factors down here. And so ultimately, 63%, that was the big number, the big takeaway from the cross-sectional analysis. 63% is the amount of variation that is explained by the student and family background factors, which is an enormous amount of variation to explain, especially considering that 7% of the variation was explained by all of the other categories. So we have 63% explaining student and family background factors, 7% being explained by schools and teachers, finance factors, and government policy factors. And ultimately, unions didn't explain any of the variation. So they actually detracted from the model's explanatory power, and so I ended up excluding the union variables from the final analysis. So overall, actually, in any model that I ran with the cross-section data, student and family background variables accounted for the most variation consistently. And so let's take a look at the 3 variables that I identified earlier. National school lunch, the variable I actually used was the percentage of students not eligible for the National School Lunch Program. And as we can see here, the coefficient is positive and statistically significant. Basically what this means is that holding all other variables constant, an increase in the percentage of students who are not eligible is associated with an increase in NAEP scores, so the relationship we'd expect to see.
Can you just, sorry to interrupt, but what's your unit of observation?
So,
school, county, state?
States, so average percentages in states, yeah. And then student-teacher ratio here was negative and statistically significant, and this just suggests then that increasing the student-teacher ratio, so adding students to a classroom, again holding all the other variables constant, is associated with a pretty significant decrease in NAEP scores. Literally, this could suggest that moving from 14 students in a classroom to 15 students in the classroom would lead to a decrease of 1.5 points on the NAEP exam. Finally, then, the instructional per pupil expenditure variable kind of had an interesting result. It's statistically significant, but negative. So spending more money seems to suggest that you would have lower test scores, but we're going to talk about why that might be in a second. So ultimately, what do these results imply? And we can think about this in the sense of what would Washington, D.C. have to change in order to be raised to the national average? So we're not even talking about raising D.C. to the performance of Massachusetts, but simply raising Washington, D.C. to the average performance of the rest of the country. So there's a couple things. Again, holding all the other variables constant, we could decrease eligibility for the National School Lunch Program by 58 percentage points. Of course, that doesn't seem very plausible considering that 77% of the Washington, D.C. students are in the National School Lunch Program. On the student-teacher ratio variable, we could reduce the student-teacher ratio by 14 students. But that again also sounds implausible considering that this current student-teacher ratio in Washington, D.C. is 12 students. And then ultimately the third variable, per pupil expenditures, the results suggested that we should decrease per pupil expenditures, holding all the other variables constant, by $12,700. But with this variable in particular, there might be a significant endogeneity problem because the cross-sectional results only look at one point in time. And so that's actually where the panel data models can be quite helpful, is because they can deal with the endogeneity issue. With the 1 year analysis, you might consider that states that are the worst performers are also trying to spend the most money improving achievement, and that's going to create that negative coefficient, which the cross-sectional results can't handle. So we're going to now go look to the panel data to kind of try to see how these variables, how the effect of these variables changes when we take into account both the time and the state differences. And so we have a few advantages of the panel data. As I've just mentioned, we can incorporate differences between states and across time by using state and year fixed effects. You significantly reduce the risk of omitted variable bias because the state and year fixed effects can account for many of the unobservable or unmeasurable factors that I don't include in my analysis. And then finally, there's just more observations given that you have more years to analyze. A major problem, though, with the panel data that I use in my study is low variation. So my study is trying to explain variation in student achievement, but if there is no variation in student achievement, it kind of becomes a hard task to accomplish. And so what we're seeing here is that on the y-axis, we have the average NAEP score in the United States. And NAEP is actually scored on a scale of 0 to 500, and note that this axis is 200 to 300. And then on the x-axis here, we have the years. And so essentially what we see is that there is no variation in NAEP scores in the United States from 2003 to 2013. From 2003 to 2013, the average NAEP score increased by 7 points, but we can see even here at the tail end that there has been no increase or decrease in NAEP scores since 2009. So ultimately, we can now think about the variation that's explained in the panel data models. I was first really excited before I realized the whole state and year fixed effects problem, because my model explained 95% of the variation. I'm like, this is great. I've discovered what's wrong with education in America. Turns out, though, that when we partial out the state and year fixed effects, that nearly none of the variation is explained by the other independent variables. So the time effect and the differences between states is what is really explaining the variation in the panel data. Nevertheless, when we looked at the variation that was explained by the various categories after partialing out state and year fixed effects, the student and family background variables were consistently had the most explanatory power. Interestingly enough, again, the unions and government policy variables explain none of the variation, so they also dropped out of the final model that I analyzed. We can also look at the coefficients that for the three variables I've mentioned based on the panel data results. And here what we see again for the national school lunch variable, coefficient 0.17 is lower than the cross-sectional results, but also still statistically significant. For the student-teacher ratio, it was not really significant, but at the 10% level it was. And the coefficient here is much smaller in absolute magnitude than the cross-sectional results. So it's still negative, which suggests that maybe increasing the student-teacher ratio is associated with a decrease in NAEP scores, but the result is highly tenuous considering the significance is not at the 5% level, and the coefficient itself is much closer to 0. So what do these results imply? Well, now to raise Washington, D.C. to the national average, we have to actually decrease the eligibility for the National School Lunch Program by 105 percentage points, which obviously isn't possible for a number of different reasons. So because student and family background variables cannot be changed to the magnitude necessary to improve the student achievement, policymakers are really going to have to focus on the other categories of variables that explain less of the variation but may still have a significant impact. And so ultimately, we can think about some of the takeaways that my study produced and 2 policy recommendations. The main conclusion is something that's confirming basically what's been shown in the literature, and that's that student and family background variables consistently explain most of the variation and a huge amount of the variation relative to the other 4 categories that I analyzed. School and teacher factors were somewhat significant, and there's a discussion in the actual thesis about the school and teacher factors, especially because the charter school variable, for example, had far less data associated with it, so I didn't include it in the analysis itself, but there's an appendix in the thesis which demonstrates that charter schools actually have a pretty positive impact on student achievement. And so what I basically concluded was that researchers need to look further at the school and teacher factors, especially in relation to this idea of decreasing or increasing the student-teacher ratio, to see if that's really going to be an effective policy solution. So ultimately, what we see today is that education reformers talk a lot about class size, increasing funding, unions, and all these things that have to do directly with the education system in the United States. But ultimately, what I've just shown you is that most of the variation in achievement isn't explained by any of those things, but rather is explained by student and family background variables. So education reformers should focus more on those factors rather than constantly talking about the within-system variables. And so my two policy recommendations that I'm going to offer you actually focused on the student and family background. First, parenting classes. This idea is actually based on a model that's been implemented in the UK. It's in its third trial phase. It's very successful. Low socioeconomic parents are subscribing to the parenting classes. They're free, and they seem to be working. And so basically what parenting classes can do is teach parents how to effectively raise their children. And a lot of you might scoff at that idea, saying things like, yeah, parents should know best and leave it to the parents. But ultimately, the research has shown that low socioeconomic status parents don't actually know that you should talk to your children in order to encourage their cognitive and intellectual development. And that result has been confirmed by a lot of studies that look at what's called the 30 million word gap. Basically, the 30 million word gap says that by the time you're 4 years old, if you come from a low socioeconomic status background, you've heard from your parents 30 million fewer words than students who come from high socioeconomic status backgrounds. And this 30 million word gap has obviously significant implications for student achievement and entering the school system into kindergarten. Second policy idea that I would recommend is higher quality early childhood programs. There's some research that suggests that programs like Head Start aren't actually very effective due to their low quality. My thesis advisor actually calls Head Start a job program for adults rather than a learning program for young children. But there's been other research done by people like James Heckman at the University of Chicago that shows early childhood education having significant future economic benefits, particularly for low socioeconomic status students. And so basically early childhood programs can bridge that gap again that low socioeconomic students experience when they enter the K-12 system. And by bringing up their performance closer to the performance of higher socioeconomic status students, we can ultimately maybe then give some hope that their achievement won't be permanently impacted throughout their entire education careers. And so finally, I'd like to close with a quote by Jane Addams, who was a leader in the progressive education movement in the early 1900s. America's future will be determined by the home and the school. The child becomes largely what he is taught, hence we must watch what we teach and how we live. And it seems that today America is really quite focused on the school and what we teach. And for good reason. We spend a lot of money on education, it's interesting to study, students spend a lot of time in schools, and schools and teachers potentially do have some impact on student achievement. But nowhere near as much as how the home life and how we live can impact student achievement. And so policymakers really cannot ignore the significant role that student and family background factors play in student achievement. And so policy ideas like parenting classes or early childhood education programs, which ironically are education programs, can help address these student and family background factors that significantly impact student achievement. Thank you so much, and I'll now take your questions.